recorder. There we go. Okay. Let me lead us in prayer. Father, we thank you again for your day and your presence. We continue to ask you to give us direction and wisdom as we are working in the various parts of your world where you've called us. Just pray, Father, today that you would watch over our technology and our session. I just pray that you'll give each one wisdom as we are working through this dissertation process. And we want all things to be done with excellence and in a way that honors you and accomplishes your purposes. So please just make that happen in each person's life. Just put these things in your care now, Father. It's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Amen. All right. I'm going to just make a few comments since I've been grading the literature review the last couple of days. And then we'll get into the research methodology chapter. But I was kind of rereading a few parts of Miriam's book. And let's see here. Okay. Are you seeing that page? Okay. This is on page 91 and 92. One of the things that I've noticed in literature reviews, people kind of go to extremes. One extreme is sometimes people write a literature review, students, and they write it as an essay, as if they are kind of putting forth their own thoughts and then bringing in, supporting literature like they would do in any other kind of essay. That's not really the intent from my perspective of a literature review. The literature review really needs to focus on the literature, okay? It's not the idea that you're going to, make your case and then use literature to support your ideas. That's good academic critical writing. But in the literature review, we've got to make sure that we are focusing on the literature. The literature itself is what drives and organizes the discussion. Miriam, she says here, doing a literature review is like participating in a dialogue with a community. You can highlight assumptions that have been made. You can add your own spin to the discussion. Okay, it's a way of contributing to the knowledge and the construction process related to the topic. But the idea still is that you need to be focused on the literature, okay? You can say something someone has said from the literature, and then you can comment on that. Sometimes I see students kind of putting forth their idea, and then they kind of bring in the literature here and there to support their ideas. Again, that is not the way a literature review works, okay? Miriam says two things. The literature provides a foundation. It provides a theoretical framework. We've already talked about that. Some of the principles, the models that are relevant to your particular study. And then how the present study advances, refines, or revises what is already known. Okay, and we want that to happen in the literature. We want to indicate what has happened, what has been looked at in past studies, in past writing. And we want to see what your particular study is going to bring to the table. Like we said, there's a little difference sometimes between an academic doctorate and a professional doctorate, although those lines are getting more and more blurred, I think, in our day. But the idea is, with a professional doctorate, we want to see a good research of knowledge. And then we want to see a good application of that knowledge to a particular set of issues. So that was one issue that I thought was good. Miriam brought out another issue that I thought was helpful to me. She talks about the fact that literature is going to be cited in at least 3 different places within the dissertation project. First, previous literature and writing are cited in the introduction, perhaps judiciously quoting from to build the case for doing the present study. A quote from a well-known authority about the importance of a problem and the need for research in the area will shore up the researcher's position, underscoring the paucity of the research on the topic by citing a few existing studies. Okay, we've already talked about that. As you're talking about the problem for your project, you will bring in a few, as Miriam puts it, a few existing studies, and I said they should be representative studies. Okay, and so you've already done that pretty well, I think, in the problem statement, bringing a few studies that seem to highlight the problem that you're dealing with. A second place, of course, that literature citations are evident are within the literature review section. Okay, and that's probably where we're going to see a more abundance of literature cited. Here, the literature is synthesized and critiqued, the work that has been done on the topic. Its strengths and its shortcomings are highlighted. Okay. Like I said, one extreme that people go to for literature is they kind of just put forth their own ideas and then they try to support them with some literature. That's one extreme that's not good. The other extreme is a person just kind of gives a summary of each book, but gives no critical analysis of what is going on in the book. And so, as Miriam says, there needs to be synthesis, summarizing and bringing together thoughts from various authors and critiquing it. Strengths, weaknesses from your perspective, and then I would add, and how that particular source, that information, that study is going to contribute to your project. So that's a second place that you're involved in the literature review today. I think a third place, and I think this is important. Third, the discussion of the findings of a study found at the end of the research report always contains references to the literature. In the discussion, the researcher points out what the study contributes to the knowledge base of the field by showing how the study's findings extend, modify, or contradict previous work. In this discussion, the researcher situates the findings of the study within the literature base on the topic, pointing out what new insights have been found, what aspects of the theory have been challenged, and so on. You won't be doing this in the proposal, but when you get to the actual writing of the dissertation, the last chapter, chapter 5, is called discussion. And there's several places in that chapter that we will want you to reflect upon what your study has accomplished, summarizing how it's contributed to the field of practitioner scholars. There's a place there for theological reflection. Okay, what have you seen that has really been demonstrated to you, some principles of theology? That's all going to come out in the discussion chapter when you actually get into the actual dissertation writing. So that's helpful to me. She said sometimes even the same citation may appear in 3 different places. So it may be that a quote was very important and you used it to support something in the problem statement. Miriam says you can then maybe just repeat that same citation in the literature review. I guess that would be acceptable. If you've already indicated it in the introduction, I'm a little more comfortable with just summarizing what an author said that you possibly directly quoted in the introduction. Okay, but Miriam makes the point that you may end up just, if it's a very important quotation, you may cite that again within the literature review, and you may, if it was just really germane to your project, it might be something you're going to bring out at the end of the dissertation in the discussion chapter. So some of those comments just help me anyway a little bit as I'm thinking about a literature review. Any thoughts or questions on those issues right now before we move into the research methodology section?
Bill, I will just say that was one of the questions I was going to bring to the call today. So I'm so glad you did this because it really helps. I was afraid to use something in one place thinking, am I just going to repeat it again later on? So that was really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and it seems to be how you're using that citation. Like I say, in the problem statement section, you're going to possibly use it to kind of document, something about the problem. In the literature review, you're going to maybe give a little more information from that particular author within the literature. And again, like I say, as you're in the discussion chapter, you may bring some very important ideas to the table there in the discussion, even though you've already dealt with those previously within the dissertation. Okay, let's go ahead and let me close that out. Let me stop sharing here. Again, you are working on literature review. I've seen a few of your papers and I've made comments, and again, this is one of the comments I did make. Another issue that I've seen, and I want to make sure that we think about this issue within the literature review. I think, as we said last week, there's going to be two different kinds of literature. There's going to be literature that possibly helps define a theory, a concept, a principle. Okay, you know, asset-based community development. There's going to be some articles that actually help define that theory, and that could be a part of your literature review. A second set of articles, though, are going to be actual research studies that have taken the concept of asset-based development, community development, and have applied it to particular situations and reported the results. We want to see some of those kinds of research studies also appear within the literature. And I've made that comment to a few of you. Try to find some articles where possibly some of the kinds of principles and theories that you're studying have been applied in practical situations and results have been reported. Those kinds of articles are also very helpful for the reader to see in a literature review. So we've got those two kinds. Articles that help define principles, theories, etc., and articles that then actually apply those in research-based studies. That we would like to see some of that kind of literature also appear within your literature review. All right. I've asked you've got an instruction sheet in week 8 that I'd prepared on the research methodology, and I always like then what we've been doing in the Zoom rooms is Dr. Henry has often had PowerPoints that she has found helpful, and it always helps to bring in other content that isn't necessarily being reflected within the instruction sheet that I've put together. So hopefully you're kind of getting content from both of us in various ways. So I'm going to turn the session over to Dr. Henry now. I know she also possibly want to make a few comments on the template, which I thought were good, and then do some more sharing on the whole issue of research methodology. So Dr. Henry, go ahead and begin to lead us on some of those issues.
Okay, thank you. So Dr. Payne, you want me to go ahead and make the comments on the template first, and then I'll do the presentation?
Let's do that. That would be good.
Okay. What I'll do is I'll pull up what I sent you to talk about it. Okay, I've pulled up the template and I'm going to go to chapter 3, which is the methodology chapter, and just make some comments in terms of clarifying the requirement for chapter 3. One of the observations I'd like to make about the methodology chapter is that it requires a certain approach to the literature. And basically, what we require of you is that this is a descriptive chapter. There's not much room for commentary, except they're relevant to the issue of the design. The underlying expectation of chapter 3 is that if you have a well-written chapter 3, which is the report on the method that you will use for the study, then anybody should be able to take that report and follow the same guidelines that you have followed and replicate the study, getting the same results. That is the ideal, which therefore means that chapter 3 must be written from an objective perspective, and it needs to have clarity. Now, one of the things I said earlier in the course is that when you read a research article, you don't necessarily have to read the whole of it at once. And also, you will need to reread it. It's not like when you do other kinds of reading. And here now that we're ready to have you do chapter 3, I would recommend that you go back to those research articles that you found relevant to your proposed study and look specifically to the section on the method of the study. Look at the method that was used and start to consider if perhaps you should use the same method to do your proposed study. That's one approach you could take. Another approach you could take is to look at a sample of studies, 3, 4, 5 of them, and compare the method of study to help you to decide which design. Method is about design, what design you will use to do your research. Okay, so chapter 3 is about the research design. Here you need to clearly state, step by step, we describe it as procedural, all the steps that you will take in the order in which you will take them to do your research. So it is a pretty boring and demanding chapter in terms of your focus. In chapter 3, we want to identify the kind of study we're going to do, whether it's going to be quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods. That has to be clearly identified. And having identified the kind of study, you want to describe and explain to the reader how you chose the participants for the study. And that is what we are referring to when we talk about sampling methods. There are different methods of sampling. Now, I am keenly aware that in our class, we do have some limitations. And one of them is that we have not necessarily had the time, and that is not necessarily an excuse, but that's just a statement of fact, to go deeply into some of the issues. For example, there's a whole class you could do on sampling methods. There are different ways in which you sample, but the method of sampling is important because it will influence, one way or the other, the results of your study. And that is why it's important that you report your sampling method. For example, in the presentation I will look at later, I think there's reference to what we call the convenience sample. There are several weaknesses to the convenience sample, though unfortunately, many times that is the method that people use to decide who will participate in their study. It is one of the weakest methods, and we don't recommend the convenience method of sampling. Now, the goal of the sampling method, as highlighted here, is to select a representative sample of the population for the research. So the idea that you want to work towards is to have a sample that you could clearly say is representative of the population on the study. that is an important guideline in terms of your sampling. This is another important piece in your chapter 3. Describe the relevant demographics of your sample: age range, gender, socioeconomic factors, educational backgrounds, and demographics that are relevant to your study. That is important. So you will be selective in terms of the demographics, and the demographics will reflect the kind of study that you have done. Usually the best way to report demographics is to just use a table. Now, the data gathering and analysis strategies, and I've highlighted here some levels of triangulation. Now, the issue of triangulation is relevant when you are doing a mixed method or qualitative study. Because what you are doing is that in a mixed method or qualitative study, you are taking information from different groups using different methods. So what you want to do is compare, for example, if you have done focus group, if you're planning to do focus group interviews, and you're also planning to look at documents pertaining to the issue that you're studying, then you want to compare the findings you get from the focus group interviews to the findings you get from the review of documents, whatever documents are relevant to your study, to see if there is a match or if there's a difference. And whether there's a match or there's a difference, you report on that, because you are not assuming that there may be a match or there is a difference. But what you want to do is to share with the reader what you have found. And in a qualitative study, you probably want to propose why there may be a difference in response from the documented issues to the focus group responses. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about triangulation. In terms of appreciative inquiry, you would only use appreciative inquiry if you're doing qualitative or mixed method study. You will not use that if you're doing a quantitative study. Okay, now this part is important. I didn't highlight it, but you need to have in your proposal the questionnaires, the interviews that you are going to use for your study. Now, another issue that I'm aware of is that we really have not taught you how to develop interviews and questionnaires. And there are particular skills that you need to have in the development of interviews and questionnaires. Now, when you're doing, and so far I have not had a sense that any of you will necessarily be doing a quantitative study, but I'll talk about the quantitative study. When you're doing a quantitative study, you're collecting data that you're going to use statistics to evaluate. When you use a questionnaire, usually we recommend that you use a pre-prepared questionnaire. That is, you use a questionnaire that has already been used and tested in prior research. When you do that, you are taking away from yourself a lot of responsibility and stress, because there's a skill set to developing questionnaires. And a questionnaire that has been pre-tested and used in another research will have built into it validity and reliability, so that you can use that questionnaire with confidence. Now, what you usually have to do is, when you find such a questionnaire, you need to ask permission of the owners of the questionnaire. You need to ask them permission to use the questionnaire. Sometimes some of these questionnaires are in the public domain, so you don't have to get permission from the owner. But if the questionnaire comes directly from a research report, and usually in research reports, it's not a part of the report, they will reference it. It's a separate document that in a dissertation, it appears at the end in the appendix of the dissertation. But you have to ask permission to use that instrument, and then you have to report that you did ask and receive permission to use the instrument that you will be using. That's the easiest method to use. But if you have to design a questionnaire, then we will have to work with you, or your dissertation supervisor will have to work with you in terms of the design of such a questionnaire that you will use. It's a skill set by itself. Ideally, in the proposal that you submit to us, if you are going to use a questionnaire, you need to have that attached to the document so that we could look at it. And what you do within the body of the paper is reference a few sample questions that you're asking and explaining why you think it's important that those questions be answered. Let me stop here to give you a chance to ask questions, as I've covered quite a few new issues here before I go on. So let me give you a chance to ask questions.
Let me make one comment and possibly a question, Dr. Hennig, because I don't think we've not talked about this. I'm wondering at the proposal stage if we are going to require the full instruments at this point. What we've always done in the past, we've asked for sample questions, sample questions, but we've always thought that the full instruments would possibly be selected or developed within the context of the dissertation. So give me your thoughts on that, Dr. Henry.
Having done this process, what I have found is that it is to the benefit of the student if the instrument is part of the proposal. Because what happens, the way I've seen it work, is that in a well-written, tightly focused proposal, I see it like a recipe book, or like a recipe. Once you have that proposal before you, after you leave the class and the professors, then you just follow the guidelines that are in that proposal. You don't have to worry about whether or not you're on the right or the wrong track. However, if you don't have the full instrument as part of the proposal, chances are that when you work through that instrument, it's going to be important that you work closely with your supervisor to make sure that that instrument is cleared for use. You don't want to design an instrument on your own, administer it on your own, and then find out that you had a weak instrument. So that would be my response, Dr. Payne.
Okay, what I'm thinking, at least at the class stage for the proposal, I really don't think a student's going to have the time to really research the instruments or develop an instrument, if that's what is going to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
Stay for we'll call it the draft version of the proposal for this class. What I'm thinking, and of course, we are trying to develop, the second term of the dissertation process a little more fully. I'm thinking within that second term, which will take place after this class, would possibly be the better time to really devote some time to developing questionnaires, either finding pre-made questionnaires, or to be developing that with a supervisor and with some input from the rest of us. So I'm thinking I'm thinking the questionnaire will not be fully developed for the proposal draft that is submitted for this class, which is due in a few weeks.
Yes.
But for the month or two that the next class that a student would be involved in, it seems like that would be the opportune time to spend some quality time thinking through questionnaires, et cetera, and both, pre-done questionnaires and also developing. So
yes, correct.
That would be my thought, at least.
Sure.
Okay, so for the class, I think for the class, it would be good to give some sample questions, but you're not going to be held to those questions because, as Dr. Henry has said, there's a real art in terms of developing questions. Miriam has a few chapters devoted to the development of questions for interviews and surveys, but there are, there's a lot of literature on that whole issue. I think there might be a couple other books there in the recommended reading that you can look at for the development of questionnaires. So let's just make sure we're all clear on that. For the proposal you'll turn in this class, you're not necessarily going to be expected to have a fully developed instrument or instruments that you would put in the appendix. You will need to have those in the actual dissertation report.
Okay, thank you. Ethical considerations. The ethical considerations are relative to the topic that you're studying, and they're relative especially to the population on the study. For example, vulnerable populations, minors, pregnant women, people with mental health or physical challenges, handicapped, prison inmates, etc. These are some examples of groups that we call vulnerable populations. And if your study is likely to touch on that, then one of the things that you're going to need to do is to go through the BGU Institutional Review Board to make sure that your study will in no way cause damage, whether emotional or physical or otherwise, to the participants of the study. For example, there's a student I'm working with currently who is doing a study on adolescents' pregnancy. And he proposes to look at, well, some of them are even pre-adolescents, girls between the ages of 10 and 19. That is a vulnerable population. And so he would have to go through the BGU IRB board and be mindful of that. That also includes that you may have to get written permission for minors. You have to get written permissions for parents or adults who in whose care they come. So ethical considerations are very important, and those are just two of many issues that we have to be aware of when we do research. And again, working closely with your supervisor, it's our responsibility to work with you to make sure that your study is ethical. That's important. The transformational strategy, we have talked a little about that, but I think the general feeling I get as I listen to individuals in their discussions, and as I've looked at other BGU dissertations, is people seem to come to the process with a clear focus on the transformational strategy they would like to use. Now, there are strengths and weaknesses to that approach, because ideally, and in fairness to the research process, this transformational strategy should come out of the research as a result of what you find as you do the research. then you should be looking towards developing a transformational strategy. You're at a disadvantage if you come to the process already clear about the transformational strategy you would like to do, because then you're presupposing that you know the answers to your questions, you know the results of your study. And if you know the results of your study, then you don't need to do it. So you have to come at it in a tentative manner. You may have some idea of the transformational strategy that needs to be addressed. However, you have to be open to let the research guide you in the development of that transformational strategy.
Let me make one other comment. I've been kind of
Sure.
thinking about that area, and Dr. Henry and I have been kind of wrestling through a few of these issues together, and it's good. As we wrestle, we can come with better ideas. One thought that I've often put forth when we're thinking of a transformational strategy is the fact that you may have, like and Dr. Henry said, you may have an idea, okay? The idea is, though, that idea, that strategy is not going to be fully developed. For example, we've been kind of wrestling with the final project handbook. Right now, in the final project handbook, there are specific dissertation topics or projects that are basically laid out for the detailed tracks. You know, the detailed tracks are we've got the city transformation track, the organizational transformational track, and the cultural transformational track. Right now, those tracks have a specified strategy indicated. I've been I've been leading a faculty committee over the last few months that we've been looking at the final project handbook and whether or not we really should have a fully defined strategy. For example, right now for the city transformation track, the strategy that has been indicated in the handbook is a city consultation. And there's probably 2 or 3 pages devoted to the description of organizing and implementing a city consultation, okay? I think we're going to change that wording in the project handbook so that a DTL student is not required to use a city consultation as his or her transformational strategy. That being said, if you thought that a city consultation is a strategy that you think would be very helpful in the kind of project that you're doing, then the research, you need to be designing the research to ask the kind of questions for you to understand what are some of the major issues that are related to your topic that people are thinking about, and what is their perspective. You'd need to get those answers in empirical data before you could actually design a meaningful city consultation that was really going to be relevant to the issues and the needs that the people within that community are struggling with. Those issues are going to come out of the empirical research process, which then can give you the kind of strategy, content, questions that need to be asked in a city consultation, okay? So I mean, that is kind of just one perspective on how research would possibly be related to a strategy, okay? The strategy, to have a meaningful transformational strategy, it has to be specifically related in a very meaningful way to the people in that community. And the research is going to help you understand that community, the mindset, the issues, what's worked in the past, what hasn't worked in the past. All that is going to come out of a empirical research process. There again, though, do keep in mind, just give you this thought, that we are changing the final project handbook, so you are not required to do that project that is listed in the handbook. what we're going to do is put those descriptions of, say, a city consultation, an organizational assessment, and I forget what the cultural transformation, exactly what that looked like. We're going to put those more full descriptions in the appendix of the final project handbook, and then refer the reader to those appendices if he or she thinks they might like to use, one of those strategies, but not being required to use one of those strategies. Okay, just said a lot in that, but just in terms of, not being required to be using one of those particular strategies in the detailed tracks, and the fact that the research helps you understand the community in which you're going to be doing whatever type of a strategy that you'd be doing.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Payne. So I think we come to the end here. The anticipated schedule. I would just say we need to be realistic in terms of the dates we set for the completion of the project. And having committed to those dates, I want to encourage you to work as diligently as you can to meet those dates, because you know what happens when you miss one deadline date, then it throws off the whole project in terms of its completion. Okay, I just want to comment on the references. Now, in APA formatting, it's important that in your references, you only have sources that you have cited in the paper. You can't put into the references sources that you plan to cite or use. So what I do recommend is that you have two lists. You have the references list, and that may be very short, but that's okay. It's a proposal. And then following that, you have a list which I call intended sources, or intended sources that you have seen that you intend to use, you have not yet used them, and you put that under a separate heading so that when we review your work, we can see that you have not put into the references list sources that you have not yet used. Now, in academic writing, we call it padding if you put in the references list sources that you have not used. So that is the no-no. That's not acceptable. That is why I recommend that you have two lists. One with the actual references, and the second one with the intended sources that you will use as you go forward.
Let me make one other comment there, Dr. Henry. And we've wrestled with that issue before. I think the template has gone back and forth in terms of either having the potential source list and the reference list. But I think even hearing you talk now, I think that really would be the better way to go ahead and use the term, the reference list, as you've just said, for these sources that you've actually cited within the proposal. Okay, and then the second list would be additional sources that you've looked at, and they will become possible potential sources for the future. The Turabian style, and we're trying to get away from the Turabian style, but I know some of you are still using the Turabian style. A Turabian style allows in a bibliography, that particular style allows both references that have been actually cited and references that have been just consulted. Okay, that's a little difference between APA and Turabian. What I'm thinking, though, I think for our purposes, it would really be better, even if you're using Turabian, to use the bibliography as the sources that you use to put together a proposal, and then also create a separate list, which would be called sources to be consulted or potential sources, so that we can keep some kind of consistency between these two writing styles in terms of the source list. So yeah, let's go ahead and go with two separate kinds of lists, whether you're using Turabian or APA.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, comments from the class?
Hi, this is Siobhan. I have a couple of questions.
Okay, go ahead,
Um,
Siobhan.
Well, I was taking some notes as you were going. Well, let me start backwards first of all then. So, table 10, page number 10, where you have the table, if you could scroll back to that, Dr. Henry,
Okay.
um, with the schedule.
Yes. Okay.
So I'm kind of looking at the schedule and I'm just trying to make sure that within myself, and I'm sure it'll help for my classmates, that I'm being realistic, or we're all being realistic. So we turn in our final project to our supervisor. Once we turn in our final paper for this class to be graded, we still need to submit our proposal once we've gotten our grades back from you all, as well as any feedback on our proposal. We still need to make our edits and then submit it to the dissertation, the academic cabinet for approval to move forward, correct?
Yes, definitely.
So,
Yes. That's an important step. You must have academic cabinet approval before you move forward with the research, with the data collection, etc.
And so realistically then, Dr. Henry, this assignment is due at the end of March.
Yes.
So realistically, we would not likely be beginning dissertation, the DFP part 1, we would not be beginning that April 1st, because we would still need to have our grades back from you all, submitted to the academic cabinet for approval.
Yes.
And moving forward. So that makes sense.
Yes.
Let me make a comment there, Siobhan. If you're going to graduate in June of 2020, then you need to have we need to have the academic cabinet approve your proposal, ideally at their June meeting, which would be the first week in June.
Okay.
I would think the absolute deadline would be their meeting in July, which is we meet the first week of each month. So I would ask you to aim for June, the first Thursday in June, so that the cabinet would have that proposal. But the very latest would be the first week in July for their Thursday meeting. So
at any point, once we have gotten our paper back from you all and grades and any feedback, we could then make our edits and then either submit it the first week of May, the first week of June, to make sure that we are approved to move forward. And so then in scheduling our DFP or DMIN, whatever case the person is at, that would be for the next track of the DFP course. That would not be the one starting in April. That might be the one starting in June or the one starting in September, correct?
That's an issue that I'm currently thinking through, working on. Right now, a registrar who's been Judy, now Bridget is going to be functioning in that role with us, but the way it's worked in the past is that once your proposal is accepted at the academic cabinet, then that is the cue for the registrar to enter you into dissertation. What do I think we have 3 different sections of DFP for the final project for the DTL, or we have another one for the DMIN. That course runs April to June, and then June to September. Or you could do a June to September, September to December. I would probably recommend, if at all possible, that we get you into the first dissertation course, which is DFP 701A. And the other issue we've been talking about is that right now that course basically is a process whereby you can submit the different chapters of your dissertation so your supervisor and others of us who would be looking at that course can possibly give you feedback. I think what Dr. Henry and I have been talking about is that course, say DFP 701A, should also be a place where we can begin to give feedback on, say, what we were just talking about earlier, the development of questionnaires. It would be probably helpful to have some sessions on that issue when you're in that part of the process. So, yeah, you're kind of talking, I'm kind of talking right now, just brainstorming, I guess, in terms of what that process should look like. I think for right now, aim to have your proposal in to the academic cabinet, I would say by May, the very latest June, okay, if at all possible. And then you would then formally be entered into the dissertation section A and then section B courses. I'm not sure if all that's clear because, like I say, we're still working through some of those issues. But I think bottom line is get your proposal into the academic cabinet sometime within the couple of months after you get your project back from this course. We will have that graded, with our comments by the end of March, and then you should be able to then work with your supervisor. Actually, as I think about it, even for that first dissertation course, it seems to me Judy has entered people into that course even before their proposal is completely done. So that actually could be a time when you're actually kind of refining the proposal too, designing questionnaires, etc. So that could actually happen, April through June also, I would think. So, yeah.
Well, so I'm one of those that have been added to it for April, but I responded back thinking that it was not realistic since I still need to get the grade back. I still need to edit it, and I still need to submit it then to the academic cabinet.
Right.
And so that's kind of one of the personal reasons why I'm asking the question. And then really, understanding that the next track then begins in June.
Right.
For the course. And then I believe at the beginning of this course, you actually mentioned that similarly to what we're doing right now, where each week we would trek along and cover different, to make sure that everyone is moving through the dissertation work. I believe you had mentioned the possibility of something like that with the DFP and the DMin.
That's what I'd like to see. Now, whether we can actually have that process in place by April, that would be a big question. We've got an academic cabinet meeting tomorrow, Thursday. I'm going to bring this issue up, I think, with the cabinet members and try to get other feedback on the possibility on just how to organize this process from this course, the research methodology course, where we basically, develop the proposal, and then the next two sections of the dissertation course, DFP 701A, DFP 701B, want to kind of get some other faculty members' opinions and feedback on how we might be able to put that together in the best way possible. So the bottom line is, if I look at the schedule, you need to have the first draft of your dissertation completed by, I think, about the first week of December of this year. If I go back and look at what does that say? By December 4th, submit the entire first draft to the project supervisor for approval. December 11, once your supervisors approve the final draft, submit to the director of final projects, and that is me. Within 2 weeks of submission, you will be informed on the possible need to hire an editor. Basically, I just look at a dissertation. If I say, yeah, this person needs to have an editor before this dissertation can go any further. But basically, you're looking by the first week of December, you need to have a completed draft of your dissertation. So that could function either with with DFP 701A and B, either April to June and then July to September, or it could function from July to September and then October to the end of December. So I guess we could use either one of those scenarios for how those courses relate to each other.
And sir, thank you. As it stands now, we are doing this independent study with our dissertation supervisor, but
Right.
You're posing that, whether it's April or it's May or it's June, that perhaps we have a track similar to what we're doing right now, where
Right.
we're working through. Okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
that would be where we'd be working to. Like I say, though, I doubt that we would have that total process in place by April 1. If you're in the April course, though, of the DFP 701A, I'm going to have to talk to Dr. Henry about this too, but, hopefully we can at least give more feedback in that 701A and 701B than what we've been doing up till now, until we can actually develop a more fully organized course for each one of those sections of the dissertation writing process.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? If not, we could come out of this document, and Dr. Payne, will I be able to do the other presentation now?
I would like to get into that. I'm thinking, if we can go through it fairly quickly. I'd asked you, do we really maybe need a Zoom room next week? But I think we will. I think we'll go ahead and do a Zoom room, our final Zoom room next week. And if we don't get through all the, this presentation with questions now, we can do some of that. But right now I have half past the hour. So I'm saying, we would have at least 20 more minutes. If we can be done by 1/4 to the hour,
Okay.
that would be great. So about 20 minutes we would have.
Okay. This presentation is an overview of qualitative and quantitative research. Okay. Basically, the basic difference between these two, and there are several, but the first is that the quantitative research is an educational research in which the researcher decides what to study. But in the qualitative research, the researcher relies on the views of the participants. Now, it's qualitative in the sense that you are doing research to find out from the participants what focus you should have going forward in the issue that you're about to address. So that is one of the major differences. The characteristics of each. The quantitative research has a pretty clear, narrow focus. You ask specific questions, you collect data from the participants, you use statistics to analyze the data, and generally you're conducting the inquiry in an unbiased, objective manner. The qualitative study, however, you ask broad, general questions. In both kinds of research, questions are important, but the qualitative research questions tend to be broader and more general. You collect data from texts, from pictures, and other, and from archives, etc. The descriptions and analysis of the words and themes are what you use to analyze the data. And in general, your inquiry, your research does have within it a subjective, biased approach. It doesn't mean that your research is any less important, but we are aware, and you have to make aware to the reader. That's the thing about being subjective. To be subjective doesn't mean that it's hidden, but you have to spell out for the reader what are the subjective assumptions that you bring to the study. What are the differences between the two in each step? One, in identifying a research problem, in the quantitative research, you look at trends or explanations of variables. One of the things about the quantitative research is that you're looking at relationships between variables. A minimum of 2 variables and a maximum of however many you are able to study at once. The qualitative research is what is known as an exploration study, in which little is known about the problem, and you look at a detailed understanding of a central phenomenon. reviewing the literature. In the quantitative research, the major role of the literature review is in response to the questions of the study, and the same goes for the quantitative research. You justify the research problem and the need for direction of the study in the quantitative research. In the qualitative research, you justify the importance of studying the research problem. Specifying a purpose for the research. Of the two approaches, the quantitative research is much narrower and specific, and the emphasis is on measurable, observable data in terms of your variables. The qualitative research is more general and broad, and at the heart of the qualitative research is that you want to seek to understand participants' experiences. So because you're seeking to understand participants' experiences, you have to be broad and general and let the participants give you the answers that you're looking for. Collecting data. In the quantitative research, you collect data using instruments. I've mentioned those. And you collect information from a large number, I'd like to call it a representative number of individuals. In the qualitative research, you collect data using forms with general emerging questions to permit the participants to generate their own responses. And one of the ways in which you do that is by using a focus group. A focus group, you come to the group with open-ended questions and you let their responses guide you in developing further questions. In the qualitative research, you're collecting data from a smaller group of individuals. Analyzing and interpreting data. In quantitative research, we use statistics. That's the major method of analysis. In the qualitative research, we do what is called text analysis, and you look at themes. Now, there are guidelines for how you do text analysis and how you get themes from the data that you're collecting. So it is not just a subjective approach. Reporting and evaluating the research. In the quantitative study, we tend to use the standard fixed structure using statistics, and the emphasis is on being objective and unbiased. Whereas in the qualitative research, there's a more flexible structure in terms of evaluating, and you take a subjective and biased approach. Again, to be subjective and biased doesn't mean that you're not transparent. You are going to state what your biases are, etc. So what are the research designs associated with quantitative and qualitative research? Because research designs are, chapter 3 we've talked about, are the specific procedures in the last 3 steps of the research process: data collection, data analysis, and report writing. There is what we call, in terms of the quantitative study, there are what we call the experimental designs. And usually you take an independent variable and you manipulate it to see what results would occur. In the proposals that I've read, I don't think anybody is doing an experimental design. So I'm going to pass over that. Then there's the correlational design. And here we're usually looking to see if there is a meaningful relationship between variables that you're studying. When you look at correlational design, you are thinking quantitative research, you're thinking statistical analysis. One of the things about looking at correlation between variables is that we have to remember that correlation is not the same as causation. Sometimes in conceiving our research study, we are looking to see what causes the phenomenon that we are studying. That's about causation, but correlation and causation are two different things. You may have correlation between the variables, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one variable causes the other or vice versa. They're not the same thing. Survey designs. This is the more popular method that I see coming through. I think most of you, as I look at your studies, most of you seem to be moving towards what I call a mixed method approach or a qualitative study. So whether you're doing a mixed method or qualitative study, you may use survey as a part of your method of study. And this involves the administration of an instrument to collect data regarding the characteristics of a particular group. There are grounded designs of survey. That's one kind of design where you start with a theory that is developed, and then in grounded design, you're not necessarily testing hypothesis. What you're doing is, as a result of the data that you collect, you may propose hypothesis. Hypothesis being the statement of relationship between variables. Then there's the ethnographic design. And here you're looking at the study and systematic recording of human cultures. Again, my sense is I don't think any of you will be doing an ethnography. So I'm going to pass this over. Okay. Then there's what is called the narrative research design, where we elicit stories from individuals. And then we look through those stories to find what are some common themes, etc. And then the mixed method study, which is what we've been talking about, where you do both the quantitative survey and then you have interviews or focus groups. But what is most important about your method, whatever method you're going to use to do your research, and I think we've established that, is that the questions of your study, which is what chapter 1 is about, will guide you as to the method that you're going to use to answer those questions. Then there are what we call action designs, where you go into a disciplined inquiry into practices undertaken by those involved in them. And this is usually done to inform and change practice. It could focus on a single issue, and this PowerPoint comes out of education. It could focus on a single issue in a classroom or a program. Okay, I think we'll stop here. I am going to put this in the course, but any questions or comments, I may have gone through this very quickly, but questions or comments?
I'll go ahead and make a few comments just to add my perspective. These various approaches, especially to the qualitative approach, I think you will find in Miriam's book. I think Creswell also mentions them, when we talk about grounded theory. It's the, idea that the theories emerge out of the ground, so to speak, of the data. When you're talking to people, themes start to emerge out of that interview. And Dr. Henry showed some slides in terms of, how you take the text of an interview and you start to analyze it. You code it, for example. I use the, in some of the examples, I talk about doing a project, say in Seattle with gangs, trying to understand a gang person's mentality. I may talk to a gang member and I will be listening for themes. I say, what caused you to join a gang? I needed a sense of belonging. I needed a place to live. I may talk to another person, I felt like I was alone. I just needed, I needed some other people. I needed to, anyway, maybe I see the word belonging. And then another person said, I feel alone and I need to feel part of a group. That's a theme. That may emerge out of several interviews, a sense of belonging. Okay, so I'll know that's a characteristic I'm going to note in my thinking and so that's a qualitative kind of interview. When we're talking about a narrative, Dr. Henry did mention the narrative approach. And again, you can read on these, but a narrative is a little more a sense that you don't direct the interview quite as closely. You're allowing that person to kind of free associate, as we talk in psychology, and they begin to just talk. You may guide the conversation and try to bring them out bring them out and facilitate a conversation in that way. But a narrative then is you're allowing a person to tell their story, his or her story, and that's a narrative. Sometimes we'll talk about a composite narrative. You may put together pieces of a lot of different stories and you get a composite narrative which kind of represents a typical person, say, in a gang. They needed a sense of belonging. They needed protection. They needed a place to live. Some of those common themes I may put into a composite narrative based on several interviews that I have done. I talked about an ethnography, and like I say, a full ethnography is not really an acceptable project at BGU, although parts of an ethnography may be a part of your work. Okay. Ethnography basically is you're looking at a people group. Okay. And you're trying to understand what are some of the common characteristics, what's the common worldview issues. Some of those pieces may be germane to your project, say in terms of the context, as you're talking about the context. So you'll need to know a little bit about the ethnography. But a full ethnographic study is where you may go and live with a group for several months, and you're conducting focus groups, etc., and you put together a whole ethnography, and that becomes the focus of your project. Like I said, that wouldn't necessarily be an acceptable project at BGU because it would need to lead to, unless it led to some kind of a transformational strategy that was going to be helpful within that particular culture. Anyway, I just tried to give you, just verbalize a little more some of these concepts that are sometimes difficult to follow when you're kind of looking at those. But again, Miriam and Cresswell, and somewhat in Sensing, will give you a little more full detail on some of these particular approaches. Other questions or thoughts? Or have we totally confused you? Okay, I don't hear any thoughts. We will talk about maybe these a little, once you get into this week, hopefully do a little bit of thinking and writing. We'll go ahead and meet together again next week for a Zoom room. Sometimes you have to kind of start thinking through some of these concepts before you even know what to ask. I understand that. So let's do that. Let's kind of get into doing a little bit of thinking, a little bit of writing on this research methodology chapter. And then we'll try to talk through your thoughts, your questions next week as we have really our final Zoom room session, which will be week 9 of the course next week.
Dr. Payne, I apologize. I came in a few minutes late, and you may have already talked about this, but I assume we're still on track for this week in terms of really submitting Chapter 2 at the end of this week. Is that still the plan?
Yeah, I'd said last week that you could take an extra week to kind of be doing more reading. And even then, I'm not expecting that you're going to have a fully developed literature review chapter. Like we said, one of the limitations of this course is that you have such a limited amount of time, and you're trying to pull together all the various sections of a proposal when you really need to spend quite a bit of quality time on reading, becoming familiar with the literature within your particular topical area. So yeah, the end of this week, I'd like to have at least somewhat of a developed literature review, at least with the at least 3 topics and some content under each of those a little bit.
Just one other question: do you want us to write that? I mean, I've been trying to write it as if it's done. I mean, it's not done, but it's a little bit of posturing, writing to say, I'm trying to treat it like it's a finished product.
Yeah.
Just for the practice. Do you want that, or do you want it to be somewhat confessional in nature? Like, here's what I've done, and I mean, I'm reading this. I plan to read this. Which is more appropriate at this phase?
I think for the proposal draft, I would like to see at least 3 sources under 3 sections, kind of because of giving you practice on trying to read a source and trying to let that source interact with another source and then with your thoughts. With at least 3 sources, say in a section, and then say 3 sections, that at least give you practice on thinking that way. When you have the complete proposal that you'll submit to the academic cabinet, our handbook says a minimum of 20 sources is included in the proposal literature review, and then when you actually do the dissertation report, you have a minimum of 30 sources included in the dissertation report. But yeah, for this class, I think at least if you can at least have at least 3 sources in 3 sections in your literature review, that will at least help give you some practice and give us something to be looking at to give you feedback on.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
And like I've told a few of you, I think already, try to find a few actual research articles that possibly are taking theories and testing them in a population. I think I mentioned to you, Anthony, could you even come up with any kind of a study you could find where some planning techniques have been applied in a particular situation, and then the author reports on what actually seemed to what he or she observed. That would be a great piece to include within your literature review, some actual research, empirical research oriented articles. Okay, I've got a quarter to the hour. I think we'll go ahead and close it. I try to hold these sessions to about 1 hour and 15 minutes, if at all possible. This session has been recorded. Keep working in the online course. I don't think we'll do a discussion next week, week 9, just give you a little more time to be working on your projects. We will do a Zoom room, though, next Wednesday, and just kind of see how you're doing as you're working on the proposal, working in the research methodology section, and we can kind of do a little more just talking with each other on some of these sections and how to pull those sections together. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and close down the session. Again, thank you for being diligent to join us today, and just pray that God will continue to give you direction and wisdom in I know, a very difficult process in a very limited amount of time. All right. With that, I'm going to say goodbye. And again, may God just give each one of us wisdom for the work that He's called each of us to be doing.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Amen. Bye now.